Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this is part two of my two-part series on Marxism 101, how capitalism is killing itself with Dr. Richard Wolff. And basically, it's my response to his video to sort of explain maybe a better understanding of how capitalism actually works rather than viewing capitalism through a Marxist lens. So I recommend you check out my first video. It's quite long. I admit that's really long. I kind of ramble a bit, but I try to make my ramblings useful. And I know that I speak slowly. If you have to watch my videos in fast forward or something, but I just talk slowly. It's the kind of person I am. I speak slowly. So I hope you enjoy the video anyways. Please watch it. It is worth watching. Um, but this will be part two, and I'll just sort of start where I left off on the previous video. So without further ado, I'm going to switch over my camera and I will play the video from where I left off. Just a quick summary of what I kind of mentioned in the previous video. They talked about the dialectic materialism. They talked about a couple things, and I address those thoughts. And now we're getting into the next part of Richard Wolff's argument of why capitalism is falling apart. He was talking about the bubbles that you see within capitalism, from growth to like crash, growth to crash, growth to crash. And that's basically where he's talking about now. So that's my quick summary of what happened before, and I will now play his video.
World's workers have been depressed now for years as we move out of Western Europe, North America, and Japan into these lower. And the system totters as it encounters a very old contradiction in its current form for which they have no solution. And right now, when it's happening on a global scale, Europe is having it, North America is having it, Japan. These are the centers of capitalism. They're in the most trouble right now, and they don't see a way out, and I don't either, which makes it possible, for the first time in my life, to begin to see a capitalism that is in fundamental shaking difficulty. And if I were to explain to someone why you get bizarre politics, unlike what we've had for a century, it's because of this. And here in the United States, you see the kind of theatrical buffoonery, but there's more to it. Why is Trump such a character in the Republican? Why is that party literally tearing itself apart? Because it can't cope. And even the Democratic Party, suddenly confronted with a socialist who isn't marginalized simply because he gives himself the name socialist. In fact, it makes him attractive. What Bernie Sanders is proving is that the interest in socialism has captured millions of Americans.
I think that people are starting to understand this, and they're looking at things like the defense industry, and they're saying, we need an enemy. We need to manufacture this enemy to keep the war machine going since Eisenhower. But it seems like a lot of more libertarian-minded people are saying it's just cronyism, right? Yes, we live in an empire. Yes, we need this constant enemy, but it's really just the crony aspect of capitalism, and we just need to restore capitalism. You obviously go much deeper. How is all of this, especially the empire that we live in, directly related to capitalism?
Every time a system's in trouble, there are the defenders of the system who say, well, yes, I agree, right now it's really crappy, it's dangerous, it doesn't work. But that's because something has come in to destroy the really pure capitalism. If only we had that, it would work beautifully. I understand it. That's a human, you want to hold on because changing systems is frankly scary, always has been. So this is a way you can hold on to a kind of loyalty to capitalism in general while joining in the critique of the way capitalism is here. The answer I would give, which will make these folks unhappy, is, look, capitalism is what you got. And if you don't like the way it's evolved, that's very nice, but imagining that you can go back to something pure that won't then repeat the same evolution to what we have, kind of begs the question, how come? We didn't become dependent on the defense industries because a lot of people are crooks or because a lot of people have cronies whom they favor. Come on, that's not really a very profound analysis. There may be cronies all the time, but why were they successful?
Because I think that
Okay, so I was just kind of letting him talk. I wanted to give him a chance to put out his full argument. So what he basically was saying is he's looking at the political structure. He was looking at how, and this is actually a very interesting video because it was filmed on March 22nd, 2016. This is just before Trump got elected. So he's probably predicting, oh, Trump's not going to win. Maybe Bernie Sanders will win. That's probably where he's going in his mind. But that didn't happen. And I think it's sort of an interesting thing to say why that didn't happen. So basically, what happens with Bernie Sanders? Bernie Sanders is actually kind of an interesting character because he's a long-term politician. He hasn't really done anything useful within politics, but he's well known, and he's well known as a socialist. He had his honeymoon in the Soviet Union. That's the kind of guy he is. And he is this, kind of charismatic figure, I guess. And he's well embraced by those who identify as being socialists as well. And he kind of coins this term of democratic socialism, which is just another way of saying socialism, but it sounds better because it has the word democratic in it. Um, so these are kind of things that Bernie Sanders does. So if you look at what he's talking about, he's saying, well, there's this crisis that's happening in our empire, in the U.S., and it's that capitalism is falling apart. And you might believe that if you didn't understand history. If you didn't see that, hey, if you look at people today and compare it to people like 100 years ago, well, people today are so much better off that it's just night and day. Like even the worst, generally worst people off in our societies are actually better off than 99% of the people that lived in the past. So really, there's just no comparison. And a lot of that success is really due to the power of capitalism. So one of the things that they always try to do, and socialists will kind of push this, is they say, well, look how bad things are. And they won't look at that historical context. They'll just say, those people over there are really poor. Look, there's people that are homeless. Or look, they'll point to these small cases and make them amplified to make it seem like there's a really big problem. And I'm not saying things are perfect. There's that's craziness. But to say things are just a complete mess is extreme too. So the thing is, people do want to help people ultimately. And when you hear these socialists talk, there feels like there's this momentum, and somebody like Bernie Sanders might have gotten elected. Well, there's so many things that actually undermine that potential. And if you look at it from the Democratic Party, well, Hillary Clinton sabotaged Bernie Sanders. So even within the places where they have the most support, they don't have the support that they need to actually get to power. Pretty much the party of crony capitalism. It's big government. It's really shifted to this. It wasn't always the case, but it's big government and it's crony capitalism. It's ties to big money, and they don't really want to see capitalism fail, but they don't mind implementing more socialism because that means even bigger government. So, there's sort of that balance that they have to have. So that's why they never want to go full socialism, because if you go full socialism, then everything falls apart. They kind of get that, and they might talk the talk of a socialist, but they never would walk that walk, because that's a walk right off the edge. You're gonna go in bad places. Now, what ended up happening in the election was that the U.S. population rejected that form of government. They basically said, we want a businessman in, as president. And there's probably actually evidence that there was election fraud back in 2016 to help support Hillary Clinton getting elected. But nobody really noticed it because Trump won anyways. So they just didn't do it at the scale that they did in this recent election. They adjusted the numbers in order to help Biden get in this time. So, it's the general population does not want socialism, though it might feel like they do, because the propaganda is out there to say, oh, people really want socialism. You can convince young people that they want socialism because they don't know anything else. They have parents that are always supporting them. They get money when they ask mommy or daddy for their money, and they don't understand any other system. But once people get working, they don't generally like socialism because they want to keep more of their own money. They don't want to pay taxes. And so what happens is you get the young people supporting people like Bernie Sanders and AOC and all these kind of left-leaning people. But the general population will say, no way, no way. I want my tax money not to be wasted. I don't want to have a huge government that's taking all of my money. So generally, most people will rebel against socialism in a democratic state. So that's something to understand. So what he's talking about really didn't happen. It just, he's sort of predicting this collapse. It didn't happen. And he predicted this kind of switch in government. Didn't happen. And that's really the problem with Marxism altogether, that it makes these crazy predictions and they don't happen unless they're forced to happen through violent revolution. And it's really the problem with socialism, that it's not a very good predictive structure. Generally doesn't understand people that well. And as a result, when you don't understand people and you don't understand history and you don't understand economics, well, the assumptions that you make, the ideas that you come up with are generally bogus. So let me watch their next thing, and I'll kind of let it run a bit, because I talk a lot. So I'll let them speak for a bit.
The biggest counter, and I'm sure you hear this constantly, is looking at the USSR, looking at some sort of manifestation of authoritarianism like North Korea and saying, well, that's the inevitability of communism.
When capitalism emerges in Europe out of feudalism, 17th, 18th century, there are lots of places where it is started, where it grows for a while, and then it blows up, it dies, or it goes in directions that are horrible and people reject it. And that's not surprising, because you don't one day decide to go from system A to system B, set up the new system B, and everything just works ducky fine right off the bat. That's not how this happens. In every case, the transition has to go through a number of experiments. Lessons are learned. This we did well, that we didn't do well, and that's why it fell apart or took a direction we didn't like. And then eventually you get to a capitalism which covers its bets, can be better than the ones that came earlier, lasts longer, and becomes something that all people eventually grasp onto. I would expect that of socialism. Look, for most of the world, poverty is the daily grind of life, and therefore the most urgent economic objective of most people in most parts of the world is to get out of poverty, to have economic growth where the standard of living grows. Okay, in the last 300 years, the two examples of large societies that have grown the fastest are the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And just to remind everyone, in 1917...
Okay, so interesting how he almost defends capitalism there for a little bit, where he was basically saying, capitalism learns from its mistakes. And that's true. Um, a really good example of this is to look at early capitalism. I love history, so I always see things from a historical perspective. Um, if you look at early capitalism, what you have is uh, you're moving from peasantry into capitalism. So what you have is people when they were peasants, they each got a little piece of land to work on, and the whole family would work the land, and they would work day and night. They would just work all the time to plow the fields, to tend the fields, and survive. And it was brutal, 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 brutal. And it didn't matter how old you were. You were if you were a child, you would do back breaking labor just as much as an adult would. You would do you'd work the fields, and that was life for the majority of people because it took the majority of people just to produce food. So what ended up happening was uh, early part of capitalism actually kind of corresponds to the industrial age, where all of a sudden you had technology that enabled a very small number of people to produce a lot of food. And that was essential for capitalism because what happens is when you have this labor force that's freed up, that doesn't have to do the grind, the brutal work in order to produce food, you get a situation where those people are now free to do other labor. And the early capitalists exploited that. They took advantage of that labor. And I use exploitation as a positive, I guess. I don't know. I don't use it in the negative content condemnation, whatever, the negative way that socialists do. I use it in the respect that they see an opportunity and they take advantage of that opportunity. So there's all this free labor, not free. So what they do is they get women and children and men to all work in the factories. So they're all working together, and you get these brutal conditions where they're paying them very little but that little pay that they're getting paid is more than what they would have earned when they were working the fields and being peasants. But it's very little. It's brutal work, long hours because they didn't understand how many hours people should work. These were things that they had to learn. It was like building a whole new system. And so what you have is brutal child labor, brutal work conditions, brutal, brutal, brutal in every way. Looked bad, made capitalism look bad, but people learned. And what they realized was, okay, if we work these people too much, well, they die. that happens. And also, there's problems. They revolt. They get upset. They don't produce that well. So what they noticed was when they reduced the number of hours and they started treating their employees better, they got actually more work out of them. They got more value out of them. And that was very important for them to do, to see. So what ended up happening was you get companies like the Ford Motors Company. I mean, this is later on, obviously, where they were, bringing in like a higher wage. There was actually a movement to not have children working in the factories at all. And this was before child labor laws ever came into play. So what happened was capitalists solved a lot of the problems that existed within capitalism in order to improve capitalism. And that's generally what happens. Capitalists, as I said in many of my videos, there's really three things that they always have to consider. They have to consider who is working for them, their employees. They have to consider who they're selling to, the people that are buying their products, and they have to consider the shareholders. Now they have to consider all those, and they have to put value to all of those factors. If they abuse their workers, well, what ends up happening is they go out of business because nobody wants to work for them. So, and if they abuse their customers, the same thing happens. They abuse they don't make any money, well, they go out of business too. So you have to balance those three things in order to be successful as a capitalist. So a lot of capitalism was that learning curve. And the funny thing is he mentions China and Russia. Well, what happened with China and Russia? Like China and Russia, they're it's socialism. Socialism doesn't really learn. It doesn't really improve. It gets worse. It's kind of weird how, as I said in the previous video, I was talking about how governments have a tendency of running out of money, and then when they run out of money, things just gradually fall apart. They start out well, but then they gradually fall apart. And which is the opposite of what capitalism does. They start up maybe weaker with capitalism because they're not stealing other people's money, but they build and get better over time. So what happened in Russia and happened in China was you have these socialistic states collapsing. The collapse in China might not be as obvious, but what happened was China was kind of falling apart. And it really had to do this experiment with capitalism in order to kind of rescue itself. And when it did this experiment with capitalism, it actually realized that, hey, wow, this is really, really beneficial. And they still have it as state capitalism. But as I always say, a little bit of capitalism can go a long way. A little bit of socialism can go a long way too, but it's in a negative way. But a little bit of capitalism can really save the day. And China saw this. Russia saw this. And the improvements that you see in those two states is huge once they embraced the capitalism. Obviously, Russia had kind of a weird thing with capitalism where they just didn't understand it at first. And when they tried to bring it in, they made a lot of the same mistakes. You get a lot of like concentrated corrupt wealth that happens. And what happens like in Russia is you get these oligarchs. I'm not a big fan of oligarchy because it's not necessarily capitalistic. You think of capitalism as being like these really rich people and really non-rich people. But what really capitalism does is it creates competition. So what ends up happening is those monopolies that get formed get broken down just because of competition. But if you have state control or state authority that basically props up those monopolies, you get oligarchies, and that's what you see in Russia. A lot of oligarchies where these super rich people and everyone else gets ripped off. So I'm not 100% happy about the way Russia turned out, but improvement than what they experienced under the Soviet Union's time frame. Okay, so let him speak some more.
Russian Revolution happens. Russia is the most backward country in Europe. The vast majority of its people are illiterate and work in agriculture. It is a poor country that has just lost World War I, and then had a revolution, then had a civil war. I mean, to expect this society to be anything other than an economic basket case would not be reasonable. Okay, now fast forward to 1975. That's only 50 years later. The Soviet Union is the second superpower in the world. It has come through another World War, World War II, that was devastating like the first one on Russia. And nonetheless, it shows a level of economic growth that is stunning. The equality and the fraternity are not easy to find. They became critics. They literally said, wait a minute, this system isn't the road to freedom, to equality, to all the good things that people normally have championed. And they became critics. And the most important of them in the 19th century, when capitalism was really taking hold, was this guy Karl Marx.
So I think a lot of people are aware of socialism now, especially since we have a self-proclaimed democratic socialist running for president, but they don't actually understand what it means. I think they're taking little bits and pieces, free healthcare, free education. Talk about the means of production and how a socialist economy would actually be structured.
They came up with the following idea, that the problem of capitalism is two fundamental things. One, that private individuals own the means of production. They own the land, they own the factories, they own the stores, the machinery. and that the people, the owners, are really a very small part of the population. 1%, 2%, 5%, maybe even 10%, although rarely did it get that high. But that means the vast majority of people are never part of the owners. And the basic socialist idea was, if you allow a small number of people to control the means of producing all the goods and services we all need to survive, they're going to use that control to make the system work for them. And they're not going to worry about the rest of us. In other words, it's a recipe for a society that produces wealth for the top 5 to 10%, but not for everybody else. That gives power, political and other power, to those at the top and not to everybody else. So they
Okay, I'm just going to stop him there. That kind of he kind of talks about this oligarchy kind of situation where the top 5 to 10%, as he said, have all the wealth and everybody else is poor, and he blames the concept of the means of production. Now, means of production is one of those kind of old terms, Marxist terms, that is not really applicable to today, and I'll explain that. Back in the day, when Marx was formulating the whole, Das Kapital and all these, ideas around capitalism and socialism and communism, he saw that the means of production were like the factory, okay, and that it was only a handful of people that owned the factories, and the people had no choice but to work at those factories. And those factories were really what determined what got produced. And so it was the individuals that did that, the ones that controlled the means of production, were a handful of people, and the rest of the people really didn't have any ability to create goods on their own. And this was actually not really even true back then, but it's even less true now, where what happens is people have the ability to create their own means of production. And actually, the tools for the means of production, which is produce anything, goods or services or whatever it is, have actually become more readily available to everybody. So, and I'll give a very simple example of this. The computer. Pretty much everybody has a computer nowadays. I know that there are some that don't, but my point is majority of people have some kind of computer. Even in Africa, they'll have cell phones, where, even some of the poorest people in the world will have a cell phone. And that cell phone is actually a means of production. With that cell phone, you can transmit messages around the world. You can create video. You can, like, this is not a cell phone video, but, my point is I could be a YouTube star just having a cell phone. And that's a business that I could create just with those simple means of production that pretty much everybody has. That is the first time, this is really the first time in history that where everybody can be their own boss and really produce their own goods. It's an exciting time to live, actually, in terms of that. So this whole concept of a handful of people controlling the means of production is just an erroneous one. It's just not true. And yeah, frankly, it's just it's very naive. So, but it is the fundamental basis for Marxist views. The big problem that they get into when they and this is the real trick of socialism that we have to be afraid of, is they use this concept of the means of production to basically take away ownership. So one of the things that happens with this concept of means of production is they want to take private property away. So what happens is they say, oh, the bourgeoisie, they own all the land, they own all the stuff. And it's because of that that we have all these problems in our society. And if we could just make it so that nobody owns anything, but everybody owns everything, I guess, that the state owns all the private property, all the machinery, all the stuff, then we'll be all happy because we'll all be equal. We'll all have equal access to the means of production. And that's really the where they go with socialism, that they want state ownership of everything. And that is the danger, where you don't own your own house, you don't own your own anything. And people lose that ownership. There's no sense of worth to items anymore. There's no sense of, you know, really like, let's maintain this good. There's no sense of pride of ownership. Uh, there's no sense of, the things that actually make us value the very things that we own or use. And there's an entitlement that comes out of it, where I would then say, well, I'm entitled to everything, since nobody owns anything. I want to have access to everything. We all should have like Ferraris. We should all have like 20,000 square foot homes. We should all have whatever. And that's sort of this entitlement that comes out of this philosophy of government ownership, where government owns everything and we should all have equal access to all of that stuff. It just isn't a very good system. And it's a very dangerous system, because it undermines the very fabric of society, where people through ownership will maintain the things that they own. And that's a real important part of just making a society work. One of the things that happened to break down the feudalist system, and most people don't understand this, was that what happened was a lot of the peasants became minor capitalists, like peasant capitalists, where they basically were given ownership of the land that they were on. They could sort of lease it from the lords. And what happened was, they would, when they were producing food for the lord, and it wasn't their land, they would produce enough to meet the basic demands of the lord. Now, when they were given that land to use in any way they wanted, they would say, okay, I will produce enough for you, the lord. I'll give you the money, the food that I'm supposed to create for you, but I'll create extra for me. I'll create extra to sell as well. And what happened was, these peasants all of a sudden were becoming early capitalists. And because they were seeing that they could produce more and be more efficient with the land that they were using, and take better care of it. Now, if it's somebody else's land and you don't really care, you'll do a minimum. And you might not even take care of the land, and it'll fall apart. A lot of the problems that led to the growth of North America actually were due to the problems that happened under feudalism, where people just didn't take care of the land. Now, if it's your own land, you will take care of it. You'll make sure that you can grow crops today and grow crops 20 years from now. But under a feudalistic system where the lord owns everything, which is actually very similar to communism in many ways, you don't get that pride of ownership. You don't get that incentive for people to take care of the things that they own. And it's really important to understand that capitalism works through the empowering of people to feel like they have some pride, they have some stake in the things that they produce. So that's something most people don't understand, but hopefully I made it clear.
Socialist idea was, this is fundamentally unjust, fundamentally undemocratic. This is what's wrong with capitalism, and how do you solve it? You make collective ownership, not private. The society as a whole should own the means of production, the factories, the offices, the stores, so that they are good for everybody, so that what they produce is distributed roughly equally, so that the influence and the decisions are made. So social, that's why it's called socialism. It's the society that should own. It focuses on the workplace. Its idea is the way you make sure that the government never again becomes an institution over the people, but rather simply an instrument of the people, is by making sure that at the base of society, where people live and work, the wealth, the productive capability is in their hands. If you want the slogan of 21st century socialism, it's this: democratize the enterprise. End this process where there's a handful of people who make the decision. In most American corporations, and corporations do the bulk of the business in modern capitalism, a tiny group of what are called major shareholders, the people who have big blocks of shares, they select who the board of directors. 1% of Americans own 3/4 of the shares. It's highly concentrated. A tiny
Okay, so I'm going to just quickly address that democratize the enterprise. So that's very similar to what I was explaining just earlier, that socialism really does want the concept of state ownership of everything, where everybody is equal. They all are stake owners in this wealth of the nation, and they can decide, as you know, how to use this wealth, and they can each have their own little vote to get whatever they want, and that all this wealth gets shared amongst the masses. No, nobody actually owns anything, but we all share it somehow. And this is, as I said, really one of the misunderstandings of socialism. There's like so many stories about this very practice put into play where it fails every time. The most famous is the story of like the early settlement, where I think it was in Virginia, where they basically, I think it's Jamestown, and what they did was they said, okay, all the farms will all own all the land together. There's nobody that'll own any piece of the land, and we'll put all the food that we gather into the barn, and we can all share it equally. And so what happened was, after a while, people would just go to the barn and get the food that they want, and they would leave. And eventually the barn became empty, okay? Because people would be like, well, there's plenty of food in the barn. I don't have to produce anything right now because there's plenty of food in the barn. I'll just keep on going there, get the food that I need, and things will be fine. And nobody else is working anyways, so why should I work hard just to feed the other people? So what ends up happening is you get the poverty kind of sits in, where there's no more food, nobody's producing anything, and it's too late. It's winter. Everyone's going to starve to death, and everyone did. Like it was like a real crisis that they faced, where a lot of people died. Um, and that's what happens in these societies where there is no stakeholdership in making stuff, and there's no sense of responsibility that happens. So yeah, it's one of the mistakes that socialism never seems to learn from. uh, and yeah, it's just crazy that they keep on thinking that this will work.
tiny number of people, the 1%, own the bulk of the shares. How do you run a corporation? At the top is something called a board of directors, usually 15 to 20 people. How do you get on the board of directors? There's an election every year to get on that board. And the way the election works is, if you own a share of stock in the company, you get 1 vote. If you have 10 shares, you get 10 votes. If you own 1 million shares, you get 1 million votes. If you have no shares, that's how many votes you get. So there's no pretense of democracy. So if a handful of people own the bulk of the shares, they control everything. They select the 15 or 20 people on the board of directors. The board of directors decides what the company produces, how the company does it, where the company is located, and what's done with the profits. Everybody helps produce the profits. The employees have to live with the decision, but have no influence on it. It is the opposite of democracy. And if you don't have democracy at the workplace, you can never have it real in politics either, because Those at the top will buy the political system, something which we see in the United States so starkly every day that everyone knows. If workers took over a factory, had a worker co-op instead of a top-down, and the workers together decided what to do with the profits, you think they'd give a few executives $25 million so they have more money than they know what to do with, while everybody else has to borrow money to send their kids to college? It'll never happen. You think a collection of workers, say 400 in a factory, considering that you could make more money if you moved the production to China, are they going to vote to get rid of their own jobs? It's not going to happen. They're not going to destroy their community by having an empty factory. They're not going to deprive their local government of the tax revenues to run the schools and the hospitals. And they're not going to deprive themselves of jobs. Here's all those jobs leaving would never have left if it was the collective decision of the workers where this production is going to take place.
And I wanted you to...
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly address that. So basically, he's saying that the reason the jobs left, and it goes back to all this kind of like, he always sort of says all these evil people at the top that control all the votes, and that everyone else doesn't really get a vote. It's just a handful of super powerful people that basically get to decide everything. And it might feel like that. It might feel like that for most people. In theory, democracies don't necessarily work that way. The rich do try to influence lots of votes. They will try to influence votes. I know that for a fact. But for the most part, everybody does get an equal vote. And you can decide what that government looks like. Generally, though, what you actually have in a democracy is actually the opposite of what he's describing. Instead of the wealthy being the ones that control things, generally you get the poor that will control things, because the majority of, like, well, when I say poor, it's relativistic that the rich are super rich and there are a small number of them, and the people that are not nearly that wealthy represent the bulk of Americans or bulk of whatever country. And the bulk of the people actually within a nation, if you look at, for example, US, 80% of the money that's paid towards government is paid by 20% of the people. So what happens is those 20% are the ones who actually are paying for the system. Now the other 80% of the population, they pay very little into the system. They pay generally less than they actually get out. I think 60% in Canada. I know in Canada the number is roughly 60% of Canadians get more out of government than they put in. Well, what happens is those 60% will always vote for more government because, hey, if I get more when I put it into the government than I get out, then there's a benefit for me. So generally what you have is actually the opposite of what he's describing, which is that within democracies, you get the majority of the masses of people will vote for more government and will vote for things that basically line their pockets rather than lining the pockets of the very rich. And they'll generally do it where they punish the very rich, where they'll say, okay, we want more taxes for the wealthy. You always hear that, right? Where they say, let's tax the wealth more, tax big businesses, tax. And the reason they want taxes is, well, taxes don't impact them. It only impacts these rich people, these handful of people. So it's actually kind of the opposite of what he's describing. The other big thing to understand that what happens in a company is very different than what happens in business. So he described the situation where if the employees got to decide things, they would never vote for their jobs to be to be outsourced, right? They would never vote for a lot of the things that companies do that negatively impact them. And that's true. That is true. But that's actually what led to many of those jobs being outsourced. In the previous video, I talked about how unions were a very destructive force for businesses. Unions had a tendency of pushing for more money for the employees that really made it just not profitable for the businesses to run. Another thing that unions will have a tendency of doing is not just asking for more money. They'll ask for more benefits. They'll ask for sick leave. They'll ask for all these things that make the employee's life better. So it sounds good, but what ends up happening is uh, that comes at a cost to the company, and it just makes the company not profitable, and they'll go out of business. Even in co-ops, there are successful co-ops out there. There's actually some really big companies that are co-ops, but generally the people in those co-ops will be shareholders. So what happens is, if your wealth as an employee is tied to how successful that business is. So, for example, if you're an employee and you say, well, let's raise the wages of all the employees within the company, make the $15 wage or $15 minimum wage. Well, what'll end up happening is that actually comes out of the company's bottom line. And then as an employee, you will say, okay, sure, we've raised the wages, but as shareholders, we're not getting that dividend that we would have gotten had we not raised the wages. So what ends up happening is the shareholder becomes kind of more responsible to understanding that you need the company to work a certain way. And actually what you will do is you'll try to find good leadership to make sure that that company runs well. So some of these co-ops actually have very well paid executives at the top that get paid much more than the general employees within the companies, because they know that in order to attract good leadership, you have to pay big dollars. So a lot of the time, when he speaks of socialism, he thinks, oh, everyone's going to just equally split the money, and these executives, they won't get paid big money. Well, that's not actually true. Even in co-ops, it doesn't work that way, because there's different talent that's required to do the different jobs, and that talent requires different pay. So businesses that fail because of employees, where with many companies, you have these three things that you have, these three pillars of business is employees, the customer, and the shareholder. Now, if you can merge the two, the employee and the shareholder, where they basically are the same thing, where every employee has a stakeholder in the business, and that can work, and that's really what a co-op is. But if you have it where the employees get too much benefit at the expense of the shareholder, or at the expense of the customer, where they're just not producing good goods, then the company will collapse. So you got to understand these things. It's not as simple as what he's trying to make sound. Okay, I'll let him answer this next question.
Counter another argument that I hear constantly: I earned it. We earn this money.
The best way to describe this is to go back to Karl Marx and his analysis of capitalism, so that we all understand what earning is about. Let's imagine you are a person looking for a job. So you come in and you sit down, you fill out your application form, and I look at you and I describe to you the kind of work we'd like to have you do. You'll come 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and you'll sit over there and you'll do this kind of work, etc., etc. And we get through all that, and you're okay with that. And then we get to that big question: how much are you going to get paid? And let's say we dicker back and forth, and we agree on $20 an hour. So I'm going to pay you $20 an hour. At this point, Marx enters with a smile on his face and says, I'm now going to show you, the reader of his books, that when that deal is done, the $20 an hour, something is going on that you actually know, but you don't want to face, but I'm going to show it to you. When I hire you for $20 an hour, I know that for every hour that you give me your work, your brains, your muscles to work, I'm going to have more stuff to sell at the end of the day, because you're added to my workforce. You're going to help me produce more goods or more services or better quality goods and services than I would have if I didn't employ you. So I'm going to say to myself, It costs me to get Abby $20 an hour. What do I get out of it? I'm going to have the output that Abby adds by her labor. Now that has got to be more than 20 bucks. So the only way I'm going to hire you for $20 an hour is if you produce more in the hour than I give you. So when you feel in a vague way at the end of the day as you walk home that you're being ripped off, you're absolutely right. Or in Marx's language, exploited.
Okay. Okay. So uh, this is one of those standard Marxist ideas that there's exploitation of all the workers because a worker gets paid $20, but they produce, in the case that he gave, $200 worth of value. And that seems, oh, that's so unfair. Why is he getting paid so little? And the capitalist is earning so much. So let's think about this. Let's consider about how this exchange happens. The first thing that he described was that the employer and the employee negotiate. They basically say, okay, I want to pay you this much. Well, I want to get paid this much, and then they bicker about it, and then they come to a number, that $20 per hour. And whenever you buy or sell something, it doesn't matter if it's your own time or if it's your products or whatever it is, there's always a negotiation. And that negotiation produces a result that both sides feel like they are winning. So that employee might be thinking, oh, wow, this is pretty good, 20 bucks an hour. I'm doing well. My labor might not be worth 20 bucks an hour. Right? They're thinking that in their head, and they think that they've gotten the winning amount. The employer thinks, oh, at 20 bucks an hour, I can maybe get $200 worth of labor out of this person, and oh, I'll make money on it. So there's that battle where both sides, whenever there's a negotiation, they always feel like they are the winners in that negotiation. It's just like if you buy a car, you negotiate with the dealer for that car. And you want to get the best price for the car, and the dealer wants to get the most money for the car, and you basically come to a price where you feel like both of you, where both sides feel like they've won, and then you actually buy the car. It's no different from labor. Like every time people feel like when they buy something, that they are buying it with the win, that they are going to win on that. And it doesn't matter if it's buying labor, doesn't matter if it's buying goods, it's all the same. That people buy things when they feel that they've gotten a good price. Now there's sometimes when you feel, oh, when you buy something and then you find out that when you bought it, that the price went down. So I bought a fidget spinner, for example, and when the fidget spinners first came out, they were like 20 bucks. Now you can buy a fidget spinner for about 50 cents or a dollar. Okay, so you feel like, oh, I paid too much for that fidget spinner. And this fidget spinner is only worth a buck. You feel like you've been ripped off. And the same happens with employees. When they hear, oh, the company has made all this money, they think, wow, we've been ripped off. The company is making 10 times what they paid us. But that is a very ignorant way of seeing the whole exchange. Because when they made that deal, they thought they were the ones on the winning side of the argument. And the funny thing is, most most of those exchanges, it's not necessarily clear who is the winner. Like the employee that got paid $20 an hour, and then the company that made $200 worth an hour off them, it's not clear that that's going to be the case. The difference is time. So what happens is when an employee gets paid, they get paid today. So they get that $20 today, or usually at the end of the week or every 2 weeks, but they get paid relatively close to now. So that money is today. You get 20 bucks in your hand. Well, the employer, they get paid maybe 6 months down the road. If you're developing technology, like I had a friend of mine who worked for a company 3, 4 years, and they never actually produced a product. He was working there. He was helping improve the technology, and they never actually produced a product. They were just surviving on venture capital, and they went out of business eventually because they just never produced a product that was competitive enough to actually go anywhere. So they basically went out of business, and they invested huge amounts of money, and they paid their employees well, and it resulted in no profit at the end of the day. Now, had the company managed to create a really great product and they all of a sudden became the next big company, well, would the employees say, "Oh, gee, you really underpaid us"? There was no certainty about how well that company is going to do. So even if you produce something that's maybe worth $200 an hour today, you don't know if that same thing is going to be worth $200 a day, an hour 5 years from now, or even a year from now, or even a few months from now. Things change. Just like that fidget spinner. Probably to produce that $20 fidget spinner, you had labor that cost you like $10. And as they got better at the technology, create better machines to make these silly fidget spinners, what ends up happening is the price went down and more competitors got into the space, and the price really dropped. And all of a sudden, that $10 worth of labor to make that silly fidget spinner becomes worth, well, you produce something that's only worth 50 cents. so the business doesn't succeed, or has to adjust itself in order to be competitive, in order to make that 50-cent fidget spinner with that $10 worth of labor. So there's ways that businesses can kind of configure themselves to make this work. Generally, the rule of thumb, and this is just a business thing that you might, if you ever want to be a business owner, what you want to do is use the rule of three. And the rule of three works this way: that if you pay your employee $10 an hour, you want to make 3 times that on them. So I want to make $30 an hour on a $10 an hour employee. And the reason you want to have that rule of three is you're basically gambling with your money, because you're gambling that $10 worth of labor today will make you $30 in the future. And that gamble doesn't always work. So if you have that 3 times multiplier, you give yourself a cushion so that that if things don't work out, there's sometimes where you'll win on it, sometimes you'll lose. Well, all of that kind of balances out, and you'll generally create a profit. And if you look at the bigger companies, the companies that have been around for a really long time, their profit margins are very, very tight. Like we're talking like 1 or 2% sometimes. It's like really, really marginal. Now, they might have some products where they make huge profits, and they'll have other products where they make no profit or even lose money. But overall, they'll get like only a small return on their investment. And the more established businesses will have that kind of very tight margin. And it's because of this situation where money today is worth a lot more than money in the future. It's much better to get $20 today than $100 maybe in the future. So this is very misunderstood by Marx, and it's very understood by people in general, where they think that it's exploitation. As I said, both people enter an agreement thinking that they have won, and that's the most important thing to understand. And that's the biggest rebuttal that you can make to anyone that says that, oh, all labor is exploitation. It isn't, because both sides feel like they are winning in that agreement. So let's then continue.
The capitalists say, I earned it. No, you didn't. He just ripped people off. The way most corporations work is 4 times a year. They take the profits they've made in the preceding 3 months, and they distribute a portion of them to their shareholders. These distributions are called dividends. So if you own a lot of shares, say because you inherited them from your grandma, or you stole money and bought them on the stock market, there are lots of ways of getting them. But if you have them, 4 times a year, you go to your mailbox in the morning and you get an envelope and you tear it open, and inside is a check for your share of the profits that have been distributed to shareholders. For rich people, this is millions of dollars. They have all that money. What did they do exactly to earn that money? Nothing. Those people are going to tell me they earned? Earned what? Did they ever set foot in the factory? No. Do they have any idea what this company does? No. They don't care. They are simply sitting there collecting. Well, let's now do a little logic. If there are people like shareholders who get a lot of goods and services they didn't help, elsewhere in that system, people who produce what they do not get. So that means if we allow that we are saying, some people, your job is to produce a lot more than you get so that these people can get a lot more than they produce. For Marx, he stands up and says, I rest my case. This system sucks.
Famous socialist Rosa Luxemburg once said that it's either so...
Okay, so I just quickly, before I get into her next point, they talked about the shareholder. So this is another one of those misconceptions that there's this sort of shareholder that's aside and they do absolutely nothing. That's one of the biggest misconceptions about capitalism altogether, that the shareholders do absolutely nothing. When a shareholder buys a share, they're taking a risk. They're giving money that the company desperately needs in order to, hire people, to whatever. They've taken a risk, and that risk is actually a big deal. Like, as I explained with my friend, it was the shareholders that took the risk. They invested in the company and it didn't go anywhere. They lost out. They gambled. And that is the value of that. It can never be underestimated, because it is such a huge risk that they're doing, that they don't know if they're going to get their money back. And that is important to understand, and that has to be appreciated. Yeah, I don't know how to say it more than that. So, shareholders, they take a risk. That risk has, has some value to it. And if you really think that shareholders are evil for just being shareholders, and that they're just making money because they bought shares in all these companies, and why is it all those people, they get all the money and nobody else does, then become a shareholder yourself. It's very easy to buy shares. There's lots of risk involved, and you'll find that playing the stock market is a very risky thing. But you can be one of those evil capitalists that are just raking in the money if you really want to make that gamble yourself. So that's my easy answer for anyone that tries to demonize the shareholders, because if you think it's such an easy thing to just own shares and make money, then go do it.
Socialism or barbarism. Here we are 100 years later. In what ways have you seen that play out today?
The 62 richest people in the world, most of whom are Americans, not all American, but most of whom are U.S. citizens. The 62 richest people together have more wealth than the bottom half of the population of this planet, roughly 3.5 billion people. That's beyond obscene. I don't know what, I don't have an adjective that captures this, but I can describe what it means. If you look at all the statistics of the World Health Organizations, the bottom half of our population are people who die way earlier than they need to. Why? Because their diets are no good, or they don't have enough food in the first place, or they can't get to a clinic to have little problems that are easily solved by modern medical methods taken care of. It's unspeakable what happens to the lower half. If we took half the wealth of the richest, and they would still be the richest, and made it available to the bottom half. It would transform their lives, literally. Now, there's no moral or ethical justification for this situation. Number two, it is well known all over the world, despite a
Okay. Oh, this is one of those stupid things. It's like, man, levels of stupidity that kind of exist within this video. This one's like one of those another annoying things. Oh, there's a handful of rich people that have as much, like 62, he said, 62 people that have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world. That's true. I'm not even going to argue that. That is definitely true. However, what is that wealth? So, for example, let's take Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos's company hires hundreds of thousands of people. It hires a huge workforce, and they get paid. They produce goods for people. They get goods shipped around all over the place. They help people, and that business creates all of that wealth, not just for itself, but for those employees. So those employees have benefited from the fact that there is a company called Amazon. Now, what else has happened is the company itself has generated all this wealth. And it's not wealth that's being stolen from anyone else. It's not like this money has been taken and only Amazon gets to keep the money and we got all the money. That money is something that's been created. And it's really a weird concept that most people don't understand about capitalism, is that it actually creates wealth. So this is new money that really is being put into the system. New innovations have been developed. New things have actually created wealth that have helped not just the employees, but helped their customers and so forth. Now, majority of the wealth of that company is actually tied up in the shares of that company. So if you look at Jeff Bezos' wealth, for example, he's like, I think it's 150 million, a billion, 150 billion, I think somewhere around there. Most of his wealth is tied up in the value of that company. Now, if the company fails, all of a sudden that wealth gets destroyed. The great thing about capitalism is it can create wealth, but it can also destroy wealth. Like if businesses fail, well, the company becomes worthless and it dies. All that money is gone. So wealth can be created and destroyed. Now, one of the things that they always say is like, if we just take a little bit of their money, like let's say we take half of their money, they'll still be super rich, and we just give it to the poor people here, well, then they'll be better off. Well, that just doesn't work, because you're taking majority of their wealth is tied up in their business, and they just can't leverage. What'll end up happening is that business that generated all that wealth will be destroyed. And all of a sudden those people get unemployed that were working there. The wealth that was created to build it all disappears, because you've now taken the very energy out of those companies. You can't just, what they're talking about when they redistribute this wealth is really the destruction of the very thing that made the business successful and got it to that point. The funny thing is that these super wealthy people end up actually contributing a lot back to society. I think Bezos is giving 10 billion to whatever charities that he likes. They have a tendency of being very generous with their wealth. And it's money that they've earned. They go on about the concept of I earned it. Well, they have earned it. And they've earned it not by stealing it from other people, but by really generating something that was new. And the funny thing is, if you redistribute that wealth, I always think about the story where you take a handful of people. Let's say you had this sort of room where you took like a handful of people and you gave them each $100 in that room. And you check on them like a few days later. You'd notice that one person in the room has all the money, and others would have like a little bit of money maybe, but money just sort of comes, gets sort of pooled into one person's hand just because they're more savvy or whatever. That's just sort of the way things are. Um, if you just give people wealth, and this is actually a big problem in places like Africa, where if you just give them money, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll rise out of poverty. The same thing happened with the welfare, government welfare system. You give them money, give. I think they've spent like $30 trillion or something insane to try to battle poverty in the United States, but it hasn't resulted in any really reduction in the poverty rate. Actually, it's slightly increased from when it was at its all-time low, and that was in the 60s. you know, it's it's it doesn't matter how much wealth you throw at people. It doesn't necessarily bring them out of poverty. Uh, and so it's not just like, because just throwing money at people doesn't necessarily create the opportunities that are needed to bring them out of poverty. A much better way of bringing people out of poverty is to allow for entrepreneurship, where people can actually work and earn their way out of poverty. So yeah, just his stuff is crazy. It's just, sorry, just crazy. I'll let him finish and then I'll wrap up this video.
Few deniers that are still around, that the way capitalism has evolved has compromised the ecology and environment of this planet, literally threatening us with 27 diseases and 57 losses of fundamental resources. This is crazy to permit this to go on. This is another way capitalism confronts us with barbarism. And the third one is, and here the United States plays a particular role, is this notion that the Western world, the world that has the wealth and the military might, is in a war, an endless war against something as vague as terrorism, whatever exactly that is, and that this is used to justify an endless use of resources not available for people's needs, but to combat one enemy, real or imagined, after another. So we literally confront an endless military warfare state, a cataclysmic destruction of our natural environment, and a level of inequality that has no justification. Our entire economic situation would have been completely different in the last 30 years if we had had a movement, if we had had organizations to make these demands, because I haven't the slightest doubt that the majority of Americans will support all of them. You know, it used to be at this point in an interview, I would have to look at a skeptical interviewer saying, Americans support this kind of socialistic stuff. But I don't have that problem anymore, because Mr. Bernie Sanders has done me a favor by throwing his hat in the ring in the Democratic primary and running around the country as he's been doing. As a socialist, he has proven for all Americans to see that the support for something other than capitalism has now captured millions of Americans. And we don't know how many millions, because that still has to be shown. And the argument that was heard when Occupy Wall Street emerged in 2011, that this is a tiny group of people who don't represent anything, all that's gone, because Mr. Sanders has said, well, let's see. Let's see how many people are critical of the 1% versus 99. How many people will support a candidate who says that every day and who even accepts the label socialist? And the answer is millions.
Wow. Okay, so we survived. That's the very end of the video. Wow. Oops. So okay, so he was proven wrong again. That Bernie Sanders was not able to get those millions of votes, and socialism never did happen in that respect. They're trying to bring it in a different way, but for the most part, no, no, there wasn't the support for socialism. Um, just quickly, he described three evils. One is the rich, the super rich. One is the environmental, and what was the third one? The third one was something or other. I'm blanking on it now because it was just so mind numbingly stupid, some of the stuff he was saying. But with the environmentalism thing, uh, businesses are actually better stewards of their environment. Remember how I talked about the peasants? And the peasants would basically, when they were given ownership of their own land, they would take care of that land. And in a socialist system, which is kind of like the feudalist system, they really wouldn't care. They wouldn't take care of the land. It's like it's the Lord's land, and why should I take care of his land? I'm only able to subsist off it where I can get enough food just for my family and to feed him. So, so that was kind of the way that the peasants thought. And that's really the problem with socialism altogether, that there is no incentive not only to make a profit and all this kind of stuff within socialism, but there's no incentive to take care of the environment. Um, I have experienced this firsthand where I've seen government run businesses just flagrantly destroy the environment. Um, if you look at Russia, like the way that they treated the environment, like Chernobyl is a perfect example of this. Chernobyl, even though it melted down, it actually ran a few years after it melted down. They had no regard for human safety, for environmental safety. They had no safety precautions on that nuclear reactor. And it's because they didn't care, because they just wanted to get the energy that they wanted, and they wanted to do it as cheaply as possible, and they didn't care about those things because it was government concern. The government wasn't concerned about the people or anything like that. It was just concerned about producing the energy that it needed. And that's what happens with a lot of these government systems. They don't care beyond their own need for whatever it is that they need. And if it's a private business, they definitely care because if that plant melts down, then they're out millions of dollars that they use to build that plant. And so they'll do everything that they can to make sure that that plant is safe and secure. Also, if any of the employees get sick or have problems, well, they have to make sure that those employees are safe, because they'll get huge lawsuits if the employees get sick. So there's real incentives for capitalists to be environmentally friendly, and it's just the difference between the two philosophies. So I hope that this has been a reasonable critique of his videos. I hope I've done a good job of debunking it. It's a very long two videos that I've done. Um, but I hope that I have addressed many of the things that socialists will bring up. And, it's the standard arguments that I hear over and over again that just don't understand, where they just don't understand capitalism. And if they understood capitalism, they would see how beneficial it is to the majority of people. It always sounds nice, like, oh, let's take care of everybody. And it seems like so evil, where capitalism doesn't go out and, by its sheer nature, take care of everybody. And it always seems unfair that somebody has more wealth than somebody else. And these things do seem kind of bad about capitalism. But when you look at things from a different perspective, and you say, well, if people are given opportunities within a capitalist system, they're given those opportunities, they can rise out of poverty. Uh, and also, not, even though there's wealthy people and there's people that are not as wealthy, often the capitalist system will kind of favor people that work hard and are innovative and deserve that wealth. Whereas socialism does the opposite, actually. It incentivizes laziness, and it incentivizes corruption, and incentivizes dictators that kind of have to then use their iron will to basically enslave the masses. So freedom has consequences, and capitalism really is about freedom and the ability to, for people to decide their own fate, and And that could be a good thing and bad thing. So some people will in that system fall. They would just won't succeed. But other majority of people will actually do better off. And that's really what you want. You want the system that maximizes the happiness of the people, the success of the society. So what you want to do is give them as many opportunities and freedom to sort of exceed, I should say, succeed. Yeah. Wow, I'm getting tired. This was a very long video. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now. Please leave comments. And if there's something you want me to talk about, or if there's another video that needs to be addressed, please link it and I'll do my best to give my thoughts on it. Bye for now.